Welcome today to the March 14th, 2023 meeting of City Finance. And due to the storm, the heavy storm today, we are meeting all on Zoom today. So with that, can we have a roll call, please?
Yes, Committee Member Alejandro Gutierrez. Not present. Committee Member Megan Harmon.
Here.
And Committee Chair Eric Friedman.
Here. We do have a quorum, so we are on to the agenda. And first, before we get on to the item, is there any, we'll do general public comment for items under the purview of the Finance Committee, but not on today's agenda. Are there any members of the public wishing to speak? Please raise your hand in the app. Not seeing any, so I will close general public comment. And now I'll turn it over to Mr. DeMartini for item 1.
Thank you very much, Chair Freeman. Again, my name is Keith DeMartini, and I'm the city's finance director. And it is my pleasure, along with staff and the city's external auditor, to present the fiscal year 2022 annual comprehensive financial report. I'll be starting off the presentation today, and I'll quickly be turning it over to the city's accounting supervisor, Ms. Jessica Yates, who will present the bulk of the presentation today. And I mentioned earlier that the city's external auditors from Clifton Larson Allen LLP will be presenting an overview of the annual audit process, as well as providing their opinion as well. Next slide, please. The agenda for today's presentation is to give you a background of all the work that goes into preparing the city's annual financial statements, known as the ACFR. We'll go over a high-level overview of the government-wide financial statements, talking about the general fund, also the major enterprise funds. The city's auditors will then discuss the audit requirements, the process that they went through, the great deal of work that they worked on as well, and then the eventual results of the annual audit. And then, of course, we'll take questions, public comment, and help with your discussion. Next slide, please. So first, let me just give a brief background as to the purpose, the intent, the scope of the preparation of the city's financial statements. Next slide, please. So what is the ACFR? It's an acronym that stands for Annual Comprehensive Financial Report. And it is an incredibly complex set of statements and documents that make up the city's financial statements. These are statements that we are required by law, both state and federal government standards require us to produce these, and they adhere to generally accepted accounting principles, or GAAP. The purpose of them is to present in a timely way the city's financial conditions, the results of operations for all of the city's major funds. It's comprehensive because it doesn't just produce a set of tables and numbers, but it does set to provide some context as to what those numbers represent. And by doing that, by going above and beyond the minimum requirement, we pride ourselves in transparency and accountability, and we have been successful in achieving an award from the Government Finance Officers Association for many decades, actually, in producing high quality financial statements. Next slide, please. Why is the ACFR important? It's important for a number of reasons, most notably here on this slide. It's required by law, so we're fulfilling our legal obligations. Also, the city charter requires us to produce an annual financial report. So this report qualifies to meet the city's charter requirement. Our financial statements are audited by an independent certified public accounting firm, and our firm is CLA, as I mentioned earlier. This document is incredibly important when the city goes to issue debt. These statements are the basis for the official statement that gets produced anytime that the city goes out to issue debt for a particular project. And this set of financial statements is particularly important as the city's plan to issue financial statements in the coming number of months in preparation for the police facility project, the new police headquarters project. And so taking the time to produce these financial statements the way that they were produced is important for that project in particular. Also, it's just general communication to the public about how the city is performing from a financial and budgetary perspective. Next slide, please. As I mentioned earlier, the city has been able to achieve a very high standard for excellence in financial reporting from GFOA. We go beyond the minimum requirements, meeting the spirit of transparency, full disclosure. The city has received this award for 34 years, and we continue to strive to receive this award in future years as well. Next slide, please. The ACFR is a very long document. It starts out with an introductory section with a transmittal letter and information about our city organization. And then the financial statements are sort of prepared for with a report from our independent auditor, a management discussion and analysis, which again provides a great deal of context as it relates to the reader consuming these financial statements, and then the statements themselves. And at the very end, there's a statistical section, which gives a lot of trending information, as well as demographic and other information, again, to provide context. So now next slide, please. Let's go ahead and jump into the statements themselves. We're going to first start with an overview of the government-wide financial statements, which is primarily the city's general fund, but a number of other funds that roll up into it. Next slide, please. These statements are structured to give the statements themselves. There's an overview of each individual fund. The governmental funds include the general fund, our Measure C district sales tax, as well as a couple other special revenue funds. And then we'll talk about the proprietary funds, which are our internal service funds and our enterprise funds, those that operate more like a business as a standalone. And then finally, fiduciary funds, where we hold funds in trust. The major highlights that these financial statements present show a net position increase of approximately $85 million year over year. Revenues grew in fiscal year 2022, as we've been discussing with the Finance Committee all throughout fiscal year 22, as the city rebounded from the economic impacts related to COVID, particularly with sales tax and transient occupancy tax growing from prior years. Also, utility revenue in the city's main utility enterprises, such as water and wastewater, those revenues grew as well. And the city's general fund balance did increase, again, through exerting a great deal of fiscal discipline over the past couple of years, directly related to COVID as well. And then also there were more unplanned savings in fiscal year 2022 related to additional vacancies of staff positions above and beyond those that were targeted to be held vacant throughout the year. So with that, I'll turn it over to Ms. Yates, who will present a little bit more detail of the city's financial statements.
Okay, thank you. Good afternoon, Committee Chair Friedman and Committee Member Harmon. As Mr. DeMartini mentioned, my name is Jessica Yates. I'm the Accounting Supervisor for the City of Santa Barbara. Next, you can go to next slide. First, I'll be discussing the statement of net position, which serves as a measure of financial health of the city. Over periods of time, increases and decreases in net position are indicators of improving or declining financial condition. The statement of net position is calculated by the difference of total assets and deferred outflows and total liabilities and deferred inflows. Overall, a strong statement of net position, as you can see here, where assets are outweighing liabilities when compared to the prior year. We saw about a 9.8% growth, which equates to about $85.6 million. Next slide. So to give kind of a highlight of something that we encountered this year, on June 15, 2021, Gatsby 87 was implemented, which provides a single model of lease accounting. This new standard impacts the net position, depending on whether the city is the lessor or the lessee, determines how leases are reported on the statement. Of 1,477 leases citywide, 119 leases apply to this new standard. This new standard is quite the undertaking, as it required the full-time dedication of one of our two senior accountants for many months. In addition, starting in FY23, we'll be required to implement another standard, which is Gatsby 96, which is being implemented to account for IT subscription-based software. Next slide. Statement of activities. So this is a statement of governmental activities, which shows how the city's net position changed during the fiscal year. Decreases in net position are presented as expenses, and then increases are presented as revenues. Revenues related to a specific program or function are considered program revenues, whereas tax revenues, including those restricted to a particular function, are reported as general revenues. In total, revenues for governmental activities grew by 9.5% when compared to fiscal year 21. This was mainly due to the rebound of economic activities following the pandemic. Majority of this revenue is received from general taxation, which is consistent with the nature and purpose of governmental funds, particularly in the general fund. The largest tax revenues received in FY22 included sales and use at $59.3 million, property at $42.2 million, transient occupancy at $32 million, utility user taxes at $15.6 million, business licenses at $2.7 million, and cannabis at $1.7 million. Next slide. So now we'll kind of go over general fund financials. So this slide shows the balance sheet for general fund. The major takeaway here is that total assets increased by $23.3 million when compared to the prior year. This was largely due to cash and investments. The implementation of Gatsby 87, which we highlighted in the prior slide, is also represented here. Total liabilities did increase by $6.3 million, which was largely due to unearned revenues. And then in summary, the total fund balance increased by $12.8 million from the prior year, which is 33.1%. So next slide. So this slide shows general fund revenue and expense in the general fund compared to adopted and revised budget. So the adopted budget, as you can see there, had we needed an expenditure control balance of about $886,000 to balance. And then the revised budget, as noted, carryovers and prior commitments from prior years, and then also any additional action taken by council throughout the year. That's the difference between adopted and revised. The largest change to adopted budget was $9.87 million associated with the ARPA, which is the American Rescue Plan Act, which was a federal emergency grant to maintain services and address additional costs related to COVID. Other significant transfers included there are $5.84 million to the Measure C fund for that was covered through additional sales tax revenue achieved, and then $1.5 million related to the Clean Energy Fund, which was for startup costs related to the Community Choice Energy Program. The city also realized additional sales and transit occupancy tax by the end of FY22 due to economic rebound. Overall, the year ended with a favorable net change in fund balance of $12.8 million. Next slide. So here, this slide summarizes general reserves for the general fund at the end of FY22 compared to policy targets. Shown in the graph, you can see in 2020 fiscal year, there was reserves were heavily utilized, and that was due to COVID impacts. In 2022, reserves were at $465,000 above policy target, which was a great indicator of financial health. So with tight fiscal controls, ARPA funding, and then by realizing additional transient occupancy and sales tax revenues, it allowed for the city to end the year above policy targets, which was about which is $39.1 million, the target. Reserves should align with policy targets in FY23, and that also includes a transfer to the self-insurance fund, which is supporting the unfunded liability. Next slide. So now we'll go into enterprise funds. Next slide. So this slide shows major and non-major enterprise funds and related net position. The far right column, as you can see, with the arrows, they indicate whether the change or what the change was comparing the prior year. Most funds experienced positive change in net position, except for downtown parking and clean energy. For downtown parking, weekend parking has returned to pre-pandemic levels, but the weekday parking remains lower than normal, which is partly due to the difficulty to retain and hire hourly operators. The Clean Energy Fund started collecting revenue in Q2 of fiscal year 2022, so this program is still ramping up and should show positive changes in the years to come. Next slide. This is the city's statement of activities for business and enterprise funds. The FY22 adopted budget called for controlling expenses to align with anticipated revenues. Downtown parking, as I just mentioned, continues to face challenges as suggested before, but there is recovery being seen, which is good. And then the Clean Energy Fund will be covered by charges to other departments in future years, which will balance the net loss. And then the final slide. This is summarizing the fund balances and reserves at the end of 2022 for major and non-major enterprise funds. Overall, all funds are in good health with reserves at or above policy levels after considering all non-spendable, committed, and restricted fund balances. Specific to clean energy and solid waste, a reserve policy was adopted December 8th, 2022 by resolution 22-126. This policy noted that the Clean Energy Fund and Solid Waste Fund shall utilize a contingency reserve of 10% of the adopted expenditure budget after or to help buffer against significant loss in revenue or the impact of rate increases. The use of reserve to support these types of impacts will be considered one time, and future rates will need to be adjusted to address ongoing expense increases. As the clean energy program matures, enterprise projects will be established to meet the reserves. So with that, I'll turn it back over to Mr. DeMartini to discuss the annual audit.
Thank you very much, Ms. Yates. I appreciate your hard work in preparing the statements this year. Thank you very much. So now I'd like to turn it over to the city's independent audit firm from Clifton Larson Allen. I'll ask Mr. Joe Luden to come on screen. He's the city's the principal at CLA, and he'll provide an overview of the audit process this fiscal year, and then we'll wrap up. Thank you.
Thank you, Keith. Appreciate it. Good afternoon, committee chair and committee members. I'm going to go over the results of our audit for this year. And again, as Keith mentioned, my name is Joe Luden. Next slide, please. So CLA has been engaged by the city to perform a financial statement audit and to assist the city in the preparation of the annual financial statements. Next slide, please. So our audit procedures, we plan and perform our audit in order to obtain reasonable assurance rather than absolute assurance about whether or not your financial statements are free from material misstatement. And what this means is that we examine on a test basis rather than every single transaction and ensure that we have evidence to support the amounts and disclosures in your financial statements. Additionally, we obtain an understanding of the city, its environment, which includes any internal controls, and we obtain sufficient evidence about your internal controls in order to assess the risk of any material misstatement to the financial statements. Next slide, please. I'm going to go over the reports that we issued this year. The first is related to our independent audit report, which you will find on page 13 to your financial statements. Next is our gas letter. This is also referred to as our internal control letter, which we had no comments or recommendations in fiscal year 21-22. We also issued our agreed upon procedures related to the city's calculation of the GAN appropriations limit and our letter of communication to those charged with governance. And we also had two additional smaller financial statements that we issued. The first for Airport Passenger Facility Charge Fund, and the second for the California Law Enforcement Telecommunications System and Message Switching System, also referred to as CLETS. Next slide, please. So this is our main thing that we're going to be going over, and this is our auditor's opinion, which again was on page 13 to your financial statements. The structure actually has changed this year, and the format has changed from what it had been in previous years. So now we're going to be starting out with our opinions and the basis for those opinions, which is that we audited in accordance with both generally accepted and government auditing standards, and that we obtained sufficient audit evidence as a basis for our opinions, which we did do. This is going to be followed by an emphasis of matters paragraph. And Jessica mentioned this earlier, but there was a change in accounting principle this year related to the implementation of GASB 87 on leases. And I think she was very accurate in mentioning this was a very large undertaking by the city, specifically from the finance department, but it was accurately implemented in fiscal year 21-22. Next, we're going to be going over management responsibility, which is for the preparation and fair presentation of the financial statements, and for the design, implementation, and maintenance of internal controls related to the presentation presentation of the financial statements. Our responsibilities as auditors is to obtain reasonable assurance, which I mentioned earlier, and not absolute assurance that the financial statements are free from any material misstatement. The following section, the next section, is related to your required supplementary information. And we do perform certain limited procedures on this section, and this is including inquiries of management, and we ensure that this is consistent with the other information that we obtain throughout the audit process. We're also going to touch on the supplementary information. These are your combining schedules and budget actual statements, which you'll find toward the back of your financial statements. And these are the responsibility of management, and they were derived from underlying accounting records that were used in order to prepare the financial statements. This information was subjected to audit procedures during our audit and compared to the financial statements to ensure consistency. We also have other information, and this is related to your introductory section and your statistical sections. And this is not covered by our opinion, but we do read through these sections and ensure that they are also consistent with the financial statements. The final part of our auditor's opinion relates to other reporting required by government auditing standards. And as I mentioned earlier, one of the letters that we issued was our gas letter, the internal control letter. So this is really referring to the procedures and steps we took in order to issue that report on internal controls related to the city. So that really concludes our presentation, and really want to again thank you for your time, and both Nitin and myself are available for any questions that you might have.
Great. Thank you for the report. So at this point, I will open it up to my colleagues for questions. Are there any questions?
Chair Freeman, if I may, can I just go through the last few slides and then we can...
Oh, sorry. I thought that was it. Sorry. It's a little different doing it at home. All right.
No problem. Thank you again, Mr. Luden, for the summary of your audit process. I appreciate that. So just to wrap up, some major takeaways of this year's financial statements. The city had very clean financial statements again this year for fiscal year 2022. There were no material weaknesses noted, no significant deficiencies. We had adequate internal controls over financial reporting. We had a very clean audit report, something to be very proud of, and really is a testament to the hard work and dedication of not just staff in finance, but really staff across the entire city that take the processing of thousands and thousands and thousands of transactions very seriously. So it's really a testament to them. We had a strong net position at the end of the year, strong internal controls. As mentioned earlier, our general fund revenues have recovered post-pandemic, but again, we still have a number of challenges that the city has been grappling with related to pension costs, other post-employment benefit related types of liabilities. Our self-insurance fund is underfunded, as it is indicated in the financial statements as well. There is a significant amount of capital investment that is recorded in the financial statements, primarily in the city's enterprise funds, water, wastewater, airport. That is noted. It's been a focus in recent years, particularly to manage our reserves. We've had to dip into them over the past number of years, and continuing to maintain the level of reserves as indicated by our reserve policies is important, and that's noted as well. And then we move into planning for next fiscal year as well, which we had our budget work session with council last Thursday. Taking this information and using this as a basis for future planning as well is important. Next slide, please. So the recommendation before the Finance Committee today is to recommend that the City Council accepts the annual comprehensive financial reports for fiscal year ending June 30th, 2022. And I'd like to give a couple of thanks to particular staff that have particularly worked incredibly hard on the preparation of the financial statements this year. The accounting team is led by Mr. Doug Smith, our accounting manager, and Jessica Yates, our accounting supervisor. And the incredible hard work of Joe Salamek, Takero Shinito, and Sarah Lynn Boyd in the accounting team as well. Spent hundreds and hundreds of hours working with department staff to prepare these statements. And I really appreciate their hard work and dedication ongoing. With that, we'll turn it over to council questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. DeMartini. And at this point, I will open it up to questions from my colleagues. Are there any questions?
No.
I just have a couple, a couple questions, more for clarification on, it was mentioned that the 59 million for sales tax, but that's including Measure C, correct?
Yes, Chair Freeman, that is both our Bradley Burns sales tax in the general fund and also our Measure C sales tax combined. For the governmental wide statements, we put all of that together in one report.
Okay, perfect. Because I thought that number was high and then I realized that's what it was. And if you could just pull up slide 20 real quickly. Actually, the reserve slide, sorry, that's wrong. I think it's, it shows the bar graph of the reserves. Actually,
for the general fund reserves, Chair Freeman, is that the?
You know what, actually go back to slide 20. Sorry, I wrote down the wrong slide. Slide 20. This came up in the budget workshop, but I just wanted to see, just to make sure I understand this. We have this reserve requirement and the total reserves, and I know it's come up, but the total reserves also is how we plan for capital investment in those funds. Like say just the water reserve on the very top there, the reserve requirement is 32 million, but the total reserves is 42. Is that how we budget for capital expenses, is just putting them all in the reserve? Because it also makes it look like we're $15 million over where we need to be. So why are we that high? I just want to have that because it comes up a lot.
Yes, Chair Freeman, I'm glad you asked that question. Yes, that is true. This presentation of our reserves is mostly how we account for the operating fund of our waterfront. So we bring in additional revenue more than the operating expenses, but that additional amount of resources is then allocated to our capital investment, our capital improvement program. And so, yes, from a financial statement perspective, they're shown as available reserves. However, operationally and planning for in the long term, those resources are planned to be allocated for the significant capital improvement program that these enterprises have. And that is something that we will be looking to adjust for presentation purposes for our budget presentations. But the way that they're presented in the financial statements are required format for that's how they're presented for the financial statements, but we can do that for budget preparation.
Perfect. Yeah, thank you so much. It just comes up and it's clear for the public to know that part of that is the capital reserves that were in there. And my last question is, when we talk about, you mentioned the police station and bonding and then pensions as well, if the market doesn't perform, those are liabilities that could come on. How would that anticipate to affect our net financial position next year? Say we have say $100 million in the police station, and then say our pension liability goes up. Does that affect the net financial position, or are they accounted for separately?
Yes, Chair Freeman, that's a great question. So first I'll answer the question about the police station project. The city is planning to issue debt for that project. So we would increase the liability for future annual debt service payments related to that facility. It is planned that project will be fully funded from the Measure C district sales tax source. So from a budget perspective, we'll plan to pay for the annual debt service payment out of our ongoing Measure C annual revenue, but it will show as an additional liability related to future payments that we will need to make on that debt issuance. And then your second question was in regards to pensions. So yes, the city's unfunded actuarial liability from CalPERS is represented as a liability on the city's financial statements. So if CalPERS's rate of return is less than their planned discount rate or other factors that attribute to that liability, if that were to increase, that would increase the liability on the city's financial statements, which would in turn reduce our net position, all else being equal.
Okay, so there are some things in our net position that are out of our control, but those things that are within our control, we are taking measures to ensure that we're improving our net position. Okay, thank you. That's all the questions I have, and I didn't see any others. So with that, I'll open up to public comments. And are there any members of the public who wish to speak to this item? Please raise your hand in the app. And not seeing any, I will close public comment and turn it over to my colleagues for comments and a motion.
Just thank you, as always, for keeping us updated and, keeping us in the loop on everything, and great work on the audit process as well, per usual. So with that, I will move to accept the staff recommendation. If that's a sufficient motion.
I will second the staff recommendation.
Great. And I'll just make some quick comments before we vote. I too just want to thank staff. I also want to thank our consultants and the audit, Mr. Loden. And it's a lot of work that goes in there, especially we saw today that the changing GASB regulations on the tenants in the harbor and other areas. So just really want to recognize our staff that just a once a year thing. It's throughout the year that you're making these daily practices that lead to this result. So it's day in and day out, 365 days a year. And it allows us to have these great results in 34 straight years with receiving an award. And I don't want to tell you what I was doing 34 years ago, but it just shows how long it's been since we've been receiving that award. And I do want to thank Ms. Yates for your presentation today. I know you've just started making presentations, but you gave a great presentation, and it's a great experience to come before the finance and council give presentations. So good job on the presentation today. And Mr. Smith and the rest of your team putting this together. So with that, may I have a roll call on the motion, please?
Yes, the motion was to accept staff's recommendation. It was made by Committee Member Harmon, seconded by Committee Member Gutierrez. We'll start with Committee Member Harmon.
Yes.
Committee Member Gutierrez.
Yes.
And Committee Chair Friedman.
Yes.
Motion passes unanimously. Thank you very much.
Great. And with that, is there anything else, Mr. DiMartini?
That is all for today.
Okay. And with that, we are adjourned and see you all at council at 2 o'clock online. Thank you.